This episode of the podcast contains a discussion around sexual assault and violence that may be triggering to survivors and others.
You're listening to Simon Scriver's amazingly ultimate fundraising superstar podcast, talking all things fundraising, charities, non-profits, and more. Here's your host, as always, Simon Scriver.
Last week, as usual, I was reading my copy of Fundraising magazine, which is always a startlingly good read. And in the back, as always, we have the agent provocateur. And this month in particular, the article really struck me as something that was definitely worth exploring more and talking a little bit more. And so I've invited this month's author to come on the podcast. Today with me, I have Ruby Bayley-Pratt. Hello, Ruby.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I expect you're very busy this week, having opened maybe the floodgates of opinion.
Yeah, definitely. I've had lots of people sharing their stories, but also some really constructive conversations about like what people can do off the back of the article, which is really exciting. I'm hoping that this momentum will lead to some real change.
Yeah, well, let's see. I mean, so for the people who are listening who maybe didn't come across the article or on Twitter or don't get the magazine, could you maybe just as easily as possible in a couple of sentences, like, and do that, sum up all the problems that we're facing? What was the gist?
Sure. So I wrote the article about sexual harassment in fundraising. So I know that we've been having a lot of conversations as a sector about sexual abuse and exploitation and harassment, but I felt like we hadn't really focused on how that plays out in the fundraising environment, and it was time to do that. So the article talks about the kinds of sexual harassment that we experience and why that might be, the kind of power dynamics that exist between fundraisers and donors, and fundraisers and our kind of guru thought leader type people, and how that can play out, and how that can kind of impact on our careers and on our mental health. And I just kind of felt like, you know, everybody I asked, every director or every organization had a policy and a procedure. But actually, the more time I spent talking to my fellow fundraisers, the more kind of stories of really quite horrible things happening to them on the part of donors or senior members of staff, all these gurus I collected, and it was time to say something.
And it's quite noticeable, the response you've been getting. A lot of people sharing their stories or agreeing. I mean, I think the majority of people have kind of, well, probably all women have experienced something like this. I know every fundraiser, female fundraiser that I've spoken to, they have their story. So this is rife. This is all over the place.
Yeah, it's happening everywhere. And I think we really, we have a tendency to like to think that we're the good guys and we're kind of untouchable in that way, and that everybody who's working in the charity sector has to be a good person, and maybe that this kind of problem like doesn't exist in our kind of sphere, but it does. And every female fundraiser, well, the most of them will have a story, and that will vary. It will either be about like inappropriate comments or behavior or touching, right up to kind of sexual assault. And I've had streams of people contacting me on LinkedIn and on Twitter, kind of with their stories. And I knew it was an issue, but I hadn't quite appreciated the scale of it, and actually the kind of magnitude of the things that are happening until I started to receive them. And I've been keeping a list, and it's really quite shocking and really sad.
Really? Were you really like, was there stuff coming in that you didn't expect? I mean, did it even exceed your thoughts on what was happening?
Yeah, so I had experienced what I would call an assault as a fundraiser. But I still felt, despite the fact that I spent a lot of time having these conversations with people and kind of and in this space when it comes to my activism, that I was kind of in the minority. And a lot of people have come forward with things that are much more severe than I was expecting. and some things which, you know, are outright crimes that they haven't gone on to report, which is sad and scary. But I think it highlights this thing and this idea of all of that innocuous stuff that happens, from the comments to the touching to the dancing and the things that people consider to be kind of low level and not that serious. It makes way for the horrific, and they're all part of the same system. And we can't get rid of the horrific stuff at the top of what I describe as the pyramid without getting rid of the stuff at the bottom. And it's all connected. And I think that people are seeing that much more now, because they are seeing these like lists and lists and lists of things that people have experienced, and kind of seeing that golden thread throughout.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to talk about this, and I think I warned you beforehand that there's almost like not a fear in me talking about this, but you know, I think as a man, a lot of men would feel clumsy talking about this, and for a lot of men, this is completely a foreign notion. You know, the idea of what women are going through and how much we can never imagine. And I think of a tweet that I saw in response to your article, someone saying that they, in their 20 years experience, they hadn't seen this, and you basically said, well, that's because you're a man. You know, you have that defining characteristic that means you don't experience it. So for me, what I'm really trying to do is, you know, get my head around it, but also try and ask a few stupid questions that I think are maybe floating in men's heads, and maybe make a fool out of myself so that other people don't have to. In terms of like our sector, especially the good sector, this kind of came up a little bit last year, or maybe it was even 2 years ago, with like overseas aid, and there was all the scandals coming out of the UK charities. But I think people still felt like it was elsewhere. Do you think there's still a naivety in our sector that it's just not happening? And is it just the men, or are there women who are also have that maybe naivety that this isn't a real problem?
I think, as you say, we like to think of ourselves as the good guys. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I love the charity sector and I can't imagine working anywhere else. But this kind of inability to see that this systemic problem like exists everywhere and therefore must exist in our sector and in our organizations is really frustrating. And I think it probably led to the complacency around a lot of the stuff that came out about overseas aid previously and subsequently with regards to kind of safeguarding and other sexual harassment kind of accusations and incidents in the sector. I think that complacency has kind of gone away. Like, people generally are taking the kind of the risk around sexual abuse and exploitation particularly a lot more seriously. But it's just time that we start looking at our own staff and our own other relationships with external people, not just our beneficiaries. And that's what it feels like is happening now, I think. With regards to the gender breakdown, I think you hit the nail on the head with kind of men not being able to fully empathize with the situation. And that's simply because they're not living an everyday where these kinds of things are happening, from the lower level stuff on one end of the spectrum to the terrible things that happen at the other end. And I think there are lots of men who believe women when they say that, and that's the most important thing. Like, you don't have to have experienced it yourself to believe and listen and then reflect on your own behavior and how you might change. But there definitely are women who also kind of don't necessarily see the problem. So I'm not speaking on behalf of all women at all. I think that you know, some women have been lucky in that they haven't experienced that many things, and some women just don't see it, because the way that you cope and the way that you kind of particularly advance in your career is by putting up with it a lot of the time. And I certainly, all of the stuff that I described in my article, I didn't report or didn't mention, and I now have a really good job in a really good organization, and I don't know what would have happened if I'd opened my mouth back then. And I know of a lot of people have responded with the same kind of sentiment. So there are some women who, in my opinion, kind of haven't faced up maybe to how bad the situation is.
Mm-hmm. So there's possibly people who are in denial about it, but then I suppose further down you have the people who don't come out and say it necessarily. I mean, like you had said there, the stuff that you experienced, you never reported. And I know in some of the anonymous stories that were shared on your thread, I mean, I know one of the people, at least one of the people who shared those stories, and they never reported it. Just to kind of like clarify this, why do people not report this? Even now when it's, I mean, that is a stupid question, but in a time where people are coming out, what's still holding us back from saying it to our managers or authority figures?
So I think firstly, you have to look at how women generally are treated when they come out and say these things and report these things. We see it in the press every day. So, of course, we're going to internalize that fear that a woman, you know, she has to have crossed all of the T's and dotted all of the I's and gone to extreme lengths to provide evidence that she was harassed in any way for her to be believed. And even when there's proof that a crime or an incident has happened, women really have to, you know, they're really interrogated about it. They are asked what underwear they were wearing. Like, it's a hostile climate to try to report something. So I think being believed is a huge barrier. And also linked to that is like feeling that your thing might be dismissed. So I've had quite a few people message me saying, you know, this isn't as bad as that other thing I saw, but this happened to me. And I wish that people would stop saying that, because anything that happened that was harassment or that made you feel uncomfortable is bad. You don't have to compare your bad thing with somebody else's bad thing for it to be legitimate. And so I think there's a real kind of like sweeping it under the carpet because, oh, it wasn't sexual assault. So, you know, have I really got a right to say anything at all? And then the potential consequences of reporting are huge. I know women who have gone to their HR departments and been told, oh, you're just making a fuss. Like, there's nothing we can do. And somebody who has made incredibly explicit sexual comments has not even been given a written warning. So we all have these stories of how kind of other women or us ourselves have tried to report something and it's not been taken on board. And if you do report something that is taken on board, there's often kind of blowback. So you might experience like difficult relationships with people who were involved in that process. Some people have had to leave organizations because despite what HR departments might have in place to protect people, it's not enough. They don't feel like they can stay there. And I guess as a young fundraiser, I was worried, like I was so ambitious and so determined to do well that I thought that by reporting that would get in the way and I wouldn't be able to achieve what I wanted to achieve. And what organizations have to do is make it possible to report without these repercussions. And we need to create an environment that believes women when they talk about these things. Nobody is coming forward for their own gain. Everybody is coming forward from a place of emotional distress, trauma, shame, guilt, and nobody does that to get something out of it. They do that because they want other people and other women not to have to go through it.
I mean, that always amazes me, that belief that women are making this up to gain something. When you know, I can't recall ever seeing an instance where anyone comes out with an accusation that it leads to anything good for them. Like, it's just all sorts of nightmares. And I wonder, you know, you were talking about there about bringing in or organizations with policies and procedures and HR departments in terms of tackling it. I wonder, is it even possible to get to that point? Because even the organizations with policies and procedures in place, when people make these accusations, is there always that fear that they're going to be viewed as maybe like a troublemaker, or, you know, policies and procedures only do so much, because so many decisions are made off paper, so many actions are changed. I think of someone in my family who was bullied in work, and you can't define it a lot of the time. And so much is happening that's not by the books. Can we ever get to a place where there's policies and procedures or a system that enables this?
I think that you can have the most robust policies and procedures ever in place, but if that doesn't come hand in hand with cultural change, whether that's within an organization or within a society, then they mean nothing. And I think that we've done quite well on the policies and procedures side. Like, if you looked at most charities, they would have a bullying and harassment procedure. They have things in place. They would talk at great length about their zero tolerance position. But the next stage of tackling this stuff is to do the cultural work. It's to have the conversations. It's to educate people. It's to create safe spaces for people to have those conversations and to report. And to some extent, it's also about getting these people who have been perpetuating this behavior for so long out of positions of power. And I think I kind of didn't mention this when you asked me about the barriers to reporting, but as you and I both know, fundraising is a small world, and there are kind of people at the top, and I say that in inverted commas, who all know each other and have these buddy relationships, and have been instances of somebody making a complaint and somebody calling somebody else who calls their boss to kind of shut it down because they're friends. And I think we need to be really aware of those power dynamics, and basically we need to shake up like who is in power, both in our organizations, but also being given platforms, whether that's writing blogs or appearing at conferences, whatever it is. And we need to just eradicate them if that's even possible, or at the very least get them to face up to their behavior and change. And that's no easy feat, but I think it can be done. And everybody is on a journey with this stuff. Like, back to your comment about being a man, like, I'm still learning about this stuff. And there isn't some kind of utopian place that we will get to. It is always going to be a process. But having these conversations is a really important part of that.
In terms of that power, I mean, not just in our sector, but in every sector where this is coming out, it seems like that predatory element goes hand in hand with power, because I suppose you can only really be a predator if you have the power. So are we caught in like almost like a catch-22 there, where you're always going to be reporting to the to the problems? And how do you, I mean, I don't know if I'm putting that right, but how do you give the power to someone who's not a threat? Does that make sense?
It does. I think it's definitely possible to have people who have power who do not behave in this way, and we need to be like celebrating those people and ensuring that they are being like good allies. So I always say it's about not getting women in power, but getting feminists in power, because actually a feminist man can make a lot of difference to the workplace and how people feel. But yeah, most of the situations that we're talking about a junior member of staff, whether that's something they experience with their line manager or with a director or with a guru or with a donor. There's obviously a different power dynamic there, but there still very much is one. And that's the kind of denominator throughout all these experiences. How you get around that, I don't know. I think you have to have reporting kind of mechanisms and also like decision-making points, which don't just sit with the power. There has to be some way to hold people accountable.
Yeah.
So, for example, the IOF can hold people at its member organizations accountable. So there's ways at looking at it so that it's less hierarchical and more, there's ways of looking at it so that it's less hierarchical and it's kind of flatter in terms of how you hold people account. And that's how I see a lot of the women who have come forward with their stories. That's the role that I see us kind of playing, is asking these questions and kind of coming at it from the sides rather than going to the top.
Yeah. And I mean, I think things like your article and some of the stories that are being shared on Twitter, it forces the conversation, whereas when it's behind closed doors, people in power or, men, it's easy to kind of brush it aside because there's no consequence unless it's open a lot of the time.
Definitely. And what it feels like we've done is kind of turned up the temperature outside. And unfortunately, that's sometimes the way that you have to do things in order to affect change. But I know that there are men reflecting on their own behavior. I know that there are male managers who are, communicating with their teams about their position being zero tolerance and wanting to be open for people to report things. And that's a step. Like, we need to hear the people with the power say that.
Mm-hmm.
Say that they're learning, say that they won't put up with it.
Like I catch myself sometimes, almost thinking that the policies and procedures are enough, or, when people kind of come out publicly, informally, that you question why it hasn't gone through the formal channels. And then usually I kind of remind myself, like, our whole sector was built on going around the rules. When you think of like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and all good change comes from not destroying the rules, but actually kind of supplementing and working around them sometimes. But I think people have men have that fear of this kind of public shaming idea of it. And I've noticed that, like, the stories that have been shared through your timeline and through you have all been anonymous, but there's a feeling that, well, my feeling is that, like, a name is coming, or names are coming. Do you think is that inevitable? Like, are we going to have our Weinstein, or are we going to have our, not to sound so blasé about it, but is there going to be people starting to actually speak out names? Is that the next step?
My hope is that that's the next step. And I know that that's hard and it's messy and it's horrible for whoever decides to name that person. It's a very hard thing to go through. But as I said earlier, we need these people to be held accountable. And if the only way to do that is to name and shame, then that's what's going to happen. I was purposely anonymous both in my article and in the stories that I've had. And in my own article, it was about not wanting to sabotage my career. So I'm still having to think about that as I speak out, as I put myself out there. But also, the fear of facing a court case because I don't have video evidence that these things happened or whatever. It's still very scary. And then other people's stories, it's very much down to them if they feel ready and able and like they want to do that. What I'm trying to focus on is what is going to affect the most change. I don't want to blow something up for the sake of blowing something up. To have it spread across the Daily Mail is the last thing that I want, because it doesn't just damage that person, it damages our sector. And that's not, it damages our sector, and that's not what we're trying to do. But there are definitely names that are coming up frequently. And there are individuals who I suspect are a bit scared right now about what's coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would hope all men are reflecting on it, and maybe we'll talk about that in a second. But in terms of the people out there who very clearly are reading these stories that are about themselves, I mean, there really is no kind of next step for them, is there? I mean, like, what? I don't even know what I'm asking. It's just kind of, it seems like it's something waiting to explode in our sector. And I think, I can understand that there's fear from not innocent people, but the people who are naming the names because of, like you said, the fear of damaging the sector.
Yeah.
Because it's not like Hollywood where it's like, oh shit, we have to get a new director for this shitty film. It's
Yeah.
like instead, this is going to have a negative impact on the beneficiaries we're working really hard to protect.
Exactly. And I think that plays a huge part and adds a very different kind of layer of complexity to this issue in our sector. Because that's the last thing that people want to do. And you will know as well as I do that most of the people who we work with care enormously about their organization and the work that they're doing. And it's very hard to face up to, do I have to sabotage that in order to change this over here by naming? And I think that's quite scary. On the people who are reading this stuff, knowing it's about them, I found it really interesting who has chosen to engage with my article and the debate, because I know that it's out there. I mean, it's very public now. We're all signed up to civil society media. We all get the bulletin. And it's noticeable if you look at who has publicly engaged with it and who hasn't, who is scared, is all I'm going to say on that.
You sound like you're just trying to get retweets.
Always. All about the retweets.
Yeah, it's all about that engagement. I mean, for men who are like reading that, some of the stories that you've shared or other people have shared, like there's some really horrific stuff in there. There's some really horrible stuff in there. But then I think there's probably a whole section of men, and I think I'd clump myself in that, where they're reflecting and they're almost not sure, and I think across the scale, everyone thinks they're a good person. Yeah. Like 100% of people think they're doing, I don't think anyone chooses to be evil or to be like a massive asshole. They're just like, they're doing what they think is right at the time. And I think there's a whole section of people who are reflecting and going, well, maybe my idea of what's right is wrong. And how do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile what's right and what's wrong? And it's easy to say it should be common sense, but I think for a lot of people, we're raised in weird environments. I'm raised on 80s movies where the guy chases the girl to submission, until she marries him. And we're all brought up in this environment. And there's, when you talk about the gurus, they're obviously of a very different generation from you and I. How do we reconcile what is right and what's wrong? Is that possible?
I don't think any one person can answer what is right or what is wrong. I think that there's two really important things. One is to listen to what people are saying. And I don't just mean the lists of behavior on Twitter, but your closest female friends, relatives, colleagues. I think opening up a conversation with them about, on this spectrum of things, like, do you feel that I do any of these? And how does that make you feel? Is a conversation that if you're brave enough to have it, would do a lot in terms of advancing your kind of understanding of what the women around you feel is right or wrong. And how the things that you say, which potentially to you don't seem like a big deal, can impact on somebody who has a very different life experience to you just because of their gender. The other thing I would say is unconscious bias. So the first time I did unconscious bias training, it blew my mind, because I thought I was here as this like very opinionated, educated feminist doing my activism stuff. And it turns out that I had loads of unconscious bias. Like there's some scenario that they pose where they ask you to imagine a surgeon, and I could not get past the fact that unconsciously the surgeon must have been male. Yeah. And I talk about this, and here I am talking to you about this stuff. I talk about this stuff all the time. Yeah. And yet, so there's lots of really interesting reading, courses, videos, TED Talks out there about unconscious bias. And I would really recommend that any man who is just like, I'm not sure if I do any of this stuff, go there first. And speak to the people around them.
Yeah, and I think the first point you made there about actually asking, I think that's really important. That men need to. I think all of us need to stop kind of assuming, and maybe assuming we know best, and actually being open enough to actually ask, do I do any of these things, and what can I do better? And and that makes us feel a little bit vulnerable, but that's not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing, and it's something that in a very different context I think we'd be more comfortable with. So for example, I have many colleagues who are women of colour, and we work quite closely together because I co-chair the Gender Equality Network at the British Red Cross. So I'm working very closely with our BAME network and with the other staff networks that we have. And I have to reflect on my behaviour as a white person and my privilege that I have as a white person and how that plays out in the work environment and in other contexts. And it's excruciatingly uncomfortable. I remember the first time that somebody said to me, wow, you really just used your white lady privilege in that meeting. And I was like, what? That made me feel disgusting. But actually, if you take that away and you think about it and you do some work on it, and you're not scared to say, what am I doing wrong? How can I be better? That's how you change, and that's how we change society.
Yeah, it's funny because again, coming back to us as a good sector, we're trying to tell people this all the time in terms of reflecting on your privilege, reflecting on poverty, reflecting on inequality. I mean, most organizations are built on some sort of inequality. We're telling people to reflect on that all the time. But when it's a little too close to home or when it's internal, that's a really scary thing. And it's a hard thing to reflect on yourself. I struggle with it.
I struggle with it too. I've found, particularly in the context of race, that I've had to kind of make a real commitment to that, because your instinct is to shy away from it entirely, because it's so much easier to not be challenged. It's so much easier to just think, oh, but I am a good person, really. And kind of put it aside, because it's not in our faces all the time, because in that specific context, we have the privilege as white people. We don't have to face up to race. That is white privilege itself playing out. So it's very easy to become kind of look the other way, and it's very easy to become complacent about it. And I think the best thing that you can do if you're a man and you care about this and you care about the women in your lives going through this is to do that work on your own behavior.
In terms of the pyramid you talked about, you talked about the pyramid, this idea of the pyramid where there's things at the bottom, but they essentially feed in. Is that the right kind of phrasing, that they feed into the things at the top? Where, I don't know if I'm asking, where does it end, or where is there the acceptable line? I mean, is it just this consensual thing? One of the things that jumped out at me when I was reading through some of the Twitter replies, and I was still conscious that there's people getting together at conferences. I know a lot of fundraisers who are married to fundraisers, or fundraisers who are dating fundraisers. And so is there still this area where sexual talk does come up? Because it's not as simple as like it's always wrong forever, is it? But at the same time, consent should be pretty straightforward. But why are we struggling with it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, I'm definitely not of the opinion that it's always wrong all the time. You've nailed it when you say that consent is the issue. I think that I think that the majority of the experiences that people have contacted me about are experiences where they were not consenting to the behavior. Now, it might be that they felt unable to explicitly not consent because you don't want to make the other person angry, offend the other person, which then has repercussions like your career, what they might say about you, your physical safety in a lot of instances when it comes to being a woman. And also the power really plays a role there, because I would suspect, and I believe, that a lot of the gurus particularly, or the more senior people and the major donors who are perpetuating this type of behavior, they know they have the power, and they might know that on a kind of very unconscious level, or they know it consciously, so that even if they're in a situation where it seems like that person, or even if they're in a situation where somebody is not explicitly saying no, they kind of know that they have something over them. And that type of kind of manipulation is still classified as not having consent, if that makes sense. So if you try to manipulate me into having sex with you, that's still rape. And so the same dynamic applies across the spectrum.
It comes back to that power dynamic that we were talking about before.
It does. And I think with the pyramid, rape is obviously at the top and violence against women is at the top. But right at the bottom, and I think some people would disagree with this and some people find it hard, but some people find it hard to confront. But things like referring to grown women as girls in a professional context, things like calling me love or dear in a professional context, things like assuming, even though you know fine well what my job is, that I'm not senior enough to sign off on this form, that's right at the bottom of the pyramid. All of that stuff creates an environment whereby women are not taken as seriously, women are objectified, etc., 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 which then opens the doors for the more serious stuff at the top. There are many people, many academics who can put it much more eloquently than I can.
No.
No, there are. I would. There's a brilliant TED talk, which I can't remember who it's by or what it's called, but I will find you the link, which explains that really well. But it's a really important thing to hold on to. You might remember there was an episode of Have I Got News for You, where they were talking about #MeToo, and Joe Brand was hosting, and Ian Hislop said something like, Ian Hislop said something dismissive about an accusation in Westminster of somebody having their hand on someone's leg all the time, a man having his hand on a woman's leg, and he said something like, oh, well, it's not that big a deal, is it really? It's not like it's sexual assault, or something along those lines. And Joe Brand said, when you're in that situation and dealing with that stuff every hour of every day, of every week, of every year, it's exhausting. And don't underestimate the impact of that. And I just thought that was a brilliant articulation of what that kind of behavior can do.
I think there's a thing with men, because they don't live with it all the time, or sometimes even ever. I think even the Me Too movement now, there's a risk of like a desensitization to it. Yeah. Because now it's being talked about, and actually, you know, I was even just this morning, as I was kind of thinking about this call with you, or this talk with you, thinking about Me Too and the words of it, I've kind of forgotten what they meant. And what they meant was Me Too was every single woman that I know in my life putting her hand up and saying, well, yeah, actually, you know, it's not a single thing. And myself, I had moved that, you know, the words Me Too, they just roll off the tongue now because it's such a catchy hashtag. Yeah. But actually, we're at risk of maybe losing a bit of momentum at this, or are we at risk of this fizzling out again as it has before, or is this here to stay now? Are we making progress?
I think we're definitely making progress. It might not be all over the front page of newspapers all of the time, and I guess to some people kind of looking in from the outside, it could have felt like a flash in the pan. But I think if you asked any activist, policymaker, anybody working in women's rights and anybody who's an activist in this space, they will tell you that it has made it so much easier to have these conversations. We wouldn't be sat here now if Me Too hadn't happened, because the environment wouldn't have been safe for me to write that article. And I think that is quite a powerful thing to be able to say now, looking back. And there are lots of organizations, because of this wake-up call, who are behind the scenes driving forward the change. and they're using this change in the environment and the conversation and the public conscience to do the really hard work. And they might not be on the front of the newspaper, as I said, but they're out there and they're doing incredible things. And as long as we keep supporting and funding those organizations and those activists, and not get complacent about it, then I think we will definitely keep moving forwards. There's always a risk that we will go backwards. Brexit, Trump, they are all of these things are threats to women's rights and threats to everything that Me Too stands against. But the threats to everything that Me Too stands for.
Yeah.
But we just have to not get complacent about it. And I know so many amazing women who are affecting change, and men and others, within their kind of families, friendship groups, relationships, and then more widely as volunteers, as professionals, and as activists. And that's really exciting.
You've kind of put your head, I mean, a lot of women put their head up out of this. I don't even know what the word is. Put your head above
the parapet.
Yes, which you may be sick of that phrase by now. You strike me as someone who gets told that a lot. But obviously, people face different extents of negative consequences of that. I've seen a lot of positive responses to you, but are you getting negative stuff under the radar behind the scenes?
I've been really pleasantly surprised because the reception has been amazing, and I've had virtually no negative comments publicly at all. I think I was safe to put my head above the parapet because I have a good job at an organization where I knew I was supported by my both my line manager and wider senior management, right up to the CEO. I'm already working on a project in my professional capacity to look at how the British Red Cross can sort this out within its fundraising department. So I felt confident and I felt safe. And that is in no small part due to the fact that I have job and financial stability, that I'm white. I think there's a lot of privilege at play. And that's kind of why I felt like I had to do it, because I knew that I would suffer less than some other people who maybe would want to speak out about these issues. And I think that's it really. I haven't had anything negative.
And what is next with it? What is your role next? Because I've seen a few comments you've made which have kind of hinted that well, you're certainly not done with this. I don't think you're ever done with it. But is there anything coming up that you want to talk about? That we need to be keeping our eye out for?
So I'm speaking to lots of different people, both kind of institutions within our sector and publications about what we could do next in that space. I'm also speaking to quite a few kind of managers or senior leaders who have contacted me with advice about how they share the article and reiterate their kind of zero tolerance position within their teams, which is really important. So keep doing that if you haven't done it already. And finally, I think that there is an amazing group of women who have kind of stuck their hands up with me and said, I want to do more to take this forward. And we will be working together to find the best way to do that, is all I can say for now.
Yeah, fair enough. It strikes me as it'd be something very encouraging. You talking there about managers sharing things like this article, and it strikes me as something that'd be really encouraging if you're a junior female member of staff who's been, who's gone through something like this, to see your manager sharing it, or to have your manager actually raise the issue. So I'm guessing people in a place of privilege, especially men, especially white people, especially comfortable people, need to be vocal about this to encourage people to make them, like you said, feel as safe as you, and which allowed you to come forward.
Definitely. Yeah.
That's our role. That's part of our role. If people want to talk to you more about this, or people want to get in touch directly, although you may well be inundated at the moment, but when things quieten down a bit, where's the best place to find you, Ruby?
So please do get in touch if you have any questions at all. You can find me on LinkedIn, just /Ruby Bayley-Pratt. Should I do that again?
Ruby Bayley-Pratt.
I just can't say my own fucking name.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so long. I have a middle name too. It's disaster.
What's your middle name?
Alice.
Ruby Alice Bayley-Pratt.
Yeah.
Great.
Next level. And I'm not even as posh as I sound because it's just that my parents got divorced and were like, the children have to have both of our names now, so they renamed us all. Yeah. Anyway.
I'll put a link in the description anyway, so people can find. And you're speaking at IFC.
Should I do it all again? Because I kind of fucked that up.
I'd like to keep the bit in when you say I fucked this up.
You can keep that.
Okay, where can we find you, Ruby? For real.
You can find me on LinkedIn at Ruby Bayley-Pratt, and then on Twitter at Ruby Bayley-Pratt, but without the hyphen. Yeah. And I am doing a session at IOF this year about asserting your rights. So it's about really giving you the practical tools it's about giving you the practical tools for these kinds of situations and how you can kind of say no and maintain your boundaries in a way that still feels professional.
Wow.
I didn't want to just talk the talk. I want people to come away with something as well that they can use.
Wow, that's at the National Convention in July. Very good. Excellent.
Yeah, and then I will also be at IFC talking all things fundraising proposition.
Awesome. Good on you. Well done. Just last question, how do you feel about having an impact on LinkedIn where everyone is going in and taking the word guru out of their bio and their description? Like you have completely destroyed the word guru for everyone.
Good, because it's really annoying. And whenever I meet somebody who uses the word guru to describe themselves, I just think, what a wanker.
Yeah, it's true. There was, I don't know if you remember, there was a spate a few years ago where people were using the word ninja a lot in their description, and they were like fundraising ninja, coding ninja. It was pretty rough.
That's really annoying. The only one that I like is extraordinaire.
Extraordinaire.
It feels classy.
Do you think? That's because your surname is Bayley-Pratt.
Yeah, probably.
All right. Listen, thanks a million for coming on, Ruby. It was really, really good to talk to you and hear your thoughts on it. And I'll share as much as I can in the description so people can find the article if they haven't seen it yet, and find you. But I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I know you've been busy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really important that we keep having these conversations. So it's really important that we keep having these conversations and keep the momentum going. So
cool. Good on you. Thank you so much, Ruby.
No worries.
If you've been affected by any of the issues in this podcast or feel you want to read more or talk to someone, please check the description below the podcast and you'll see some links which maybe have helped you.
Hello, this is Morgan Freeman. For discounts on Simon's best-selling online fundraising courses, go to www.changefundraising.com/training and use coupon code podcast. Complete them in your own time, wherever you want. Get busy living or get busy buying.